Today I'm going to paint this beautiful watercolor landscape. It's relatively simple. We start out with a quick pencil sketch. You can see that I'm pressing very, very lightly. You don't want to press too hard because ideally these pencil lines will not show through in your final artwork. I'm just starting off with some little hills, a nice horizon line, and I will put in some mountains in the background. I grew up in Alberta, where we have foothills with Rocky Mountains behind them, so this is kind of a nostalgic scene for me. Here you see me adding in the barn. This will be one of two feature elements in this painting. I will be adding a barn and a tractor. Both of these elements will require a little bit more detail work. The more detail-oriented pieces you have in your painting, the longer your painting will take. I'm using very loose 2-point perspective here. We're looking up at the barn slightly, so my vanishing points are just underneath the barn on either side of the painting. Here I'm adding the tractor. This tractor is probably the star of the painting. There's a little bit more detail. It's closer to us. It's in the foreground a bit more. And both of these objects will be red, which will balance them out quite nicely against the rest of the painting. Adding in a few hay barrels, still trying to work out my composition. A few of these elements will change. I don't think I like these little hay bales in the front, so I'm just going to remove those. They were distracting. I do want to make sure that my tractor is the star here. So now what I'm doing is I'm using micron pens to add in a pen outline. Now some pens will bleed when they get wet. So if you choose to do your pen work before you do your watercolor work, make sure you're using a pen that does not bleed. I've used microns for most of my watercolor work and they do not bleed, but I've also tried to use Sharpie and some other brands and I have had less success with those. So do a little test run before you add your pen, just to make sure it doesn't bleed when you apply water. The last thing you want for this painting is for your lines to become fuzzy or even completely bleed into your paint. So I'm just going to kind of speed up the video here. I'm just quickly adding in the outlines. I'm going to be speeding up the video just a little bit periodically, just so that it doesn't take too long to get through. But the steps are very much the same once we get into the painting process. We're going to be applying wet on wet paint for the majority of the painting, and in the more detailed areas we will just go right in with the paint without adding water first. But a lot of wet on wet painting here, a lot of time that this painting will need to dry as well. So here I'm jumping in with that water, so we're going to be doing some wet on wet painting, adding yellow to the top. So I'm thinking about my lighting here. I'm imagining my light is coming in from the right hand side, which would brighten up that part of the hill. And then as I get down a little bit further, as I get closer to the viewer, I get a little bit more dark, a little bit more saturated with my color. So that's why I'm adding the two different greens, kind of a yellow green as an in-between color between the yellow and the dark green. And I'm doing the same thing with the section above the tractor. With a painting like this, you need to make sure that you're not ever touching a wet area to another wet area. Otherwise, your paint will bleed into each other. So I'm going to kind of be jumping around here, intentionally adding paint to an area that is still dry. So I'm going to hop around a little bit here. This area is also going to be green, grassy area. So I'm just adding in that yellow highlight. Now I'm going in with that yellowish green color, the kind of mid-tone green, to create the mid-tone. And then I will jump in with that darker blue-green for the shadow closer to the base. Because we have lots of hills kind of stacked up against each other here, it's nice to have that sort of gradient, that contrast from light to dark within each section, just to help them stand out from each other a little bit. Gives us the illusion of space, the illusion of light. When I'm planning out my painting, I'm thinking about which areas will be brown, which areas of land will be green, and which areas of land will be yellow. Those are the colors I most often see on a farm, so that's how I'm choosing to separate the pieces of land here. And I want to try to make sure that those areas are kind of separated from each other so I don't have two green pieces butting up against each other. So now I'm doing the barn. I've started in with just plain old red on the shadow side, and now I've added some water to the highlight side, and it's pulling over just a little bit of that red from the shadow. I do want to create a highlight and a shadow side to this barn, so I will work on that through different layers as I keep going with this painting. But you can already start to see the shadow and highlight within the little steeple on the barn, and also within the large part of the barn. Now I'm adding in just a kind of underpainting to the trees. I'm just going in with that yellowy green color. Just going to fill all the trees in with that color. And I'll let them dry partially, but before they're completely dry, I will add in just a little bit of a shadow on the left-hand side. Now most of my painting has kind of a wet area on it now, so that's why I'm jumping back to these little bushes way in the background here. This could be like a little chunk of forest, that's what I'm envisioning. These are big clumps of trees right in front of the Rocky Mountains. And they're going to be a little bit more, like a little bit darker, just because they're back further in the horizon. They're not going to have as much detail to them. And again, I will jump back into those when they're semi-dry, just to add a little bit more green to them. So what I'm doing now is adding water to my mountains. When I apply the paint here, I'm not going to do it in that smooth way that I was doing the paint everywhere else. I'm going to kind of try to create some texture. So you can see I'm zigzagging, I'm streaking. I'm trying to pull the darkest part on the bottom and then let it kind of fade into white as it gets to the top. Now that is reminiscent to me of a Rocky Mountain with a little kind of snow caps and then the deep darker base. So that's what I'm going to try to do with these mountains, give them a little bit of texture. Now you can see me adding in that shadow I talked about on the trees, very subtle, but it will help to tell the story of lighting. And if you can communicate a light source within a painting, I always think it makes it look just a whole lot better. And you know that goes for any artwork. Having a nice light source, having a consistent light source does elevate the artwork. Even something like this that is not realistic helps it to feel like it's in a real place, and it gives it kind of a tangible quality. So I'm starting in with the tires here because I'm not convinced that the grass behind the tractor is dry yet. But the tires, they don't really touch the background. Yeah, I'm just taking a feel. Okay, so I guess it's dry, so that's good. So I'm going into the tractor now. I'm not doing wet on wet for the tractor. I'm just using a detail brush and I'm adding in straight color. This section, it's a little bit too small to be doing wet on wet painting. So that's why I'm just going in with the color, but I'm still going to do my best to have a little bit of variation in this color. So after I add, say when I finish adding the red, I'll jump in there with a darker, more saturated red and just kind of add a few little shadows to help, again, tell that lighting story just a little bit. I intentionally drew kind of an older style of tractor. I just think that older farm equipment is kind of more visually appealing than some of the new fancy stuff. Now there's a deep, deep shadow in here underneath the wheel, where the back wheel is, and underneath the red part of the tractor. So I'm just kind of filling this in really dark. I don't want to get into too much detail in that area because it's so small. And this isn't a detail painting. This is a fun, loose kind of landscape painting where a little bit of detail is nice, but too much detail would be distracting. It would take away from the simplicity of the rest of the painting. For the windows, I want to hint at a bit of a reflection. So that's why I'm just adding kind of spots of Payne's gray here. So here I have, I'm going into my barn again. My barn is dry, so I can go into the roof and start to add a little bit of that brown texture. Again, trying to create that illusion of shadow and highlight, so I'm loading the paint up on the left-hand side and I'm letting it kind of naturally fade into the right-hand side. And I will go back in and add some texture later on in the painting. One of the last steps I'll do is just go through and add some texture to these detail areas. So just like the other sections here, I'm adding some brown. So I'm going to be adding the 2 different browns here, kind of a nice reddish brown, a little bit brighter, and then a more deep brown for the shadow. Your colors don't have to be the same as mine. Oh, sorry, my little girl is running around the house, and every time she runs around the house, my camera shakes a bit there. So we have a few seconds here of shaky footage. What was I saying? Oh yes, we're talking about browns. So with your paint colors, they don't have to be exactly my paint colors. That's why I'm not being prescriptive with the paint colors in this particular painting. Any kind of, couple brown variation, a couple green variation. I love Payne's Gray. That's what I use for my mountains. That's what I use for my tractor. That's a color that I use pretty much in every painting I do. Yeah, but any kind of, you could even use black for your tractor. Any colors will work. So I'll leave that up to you. So here again, I'm trying to add that texture to the mountain. The mountains are probably my favorite part of this. I just really enjoy trying to get that nice gradual texture there. And the silo, I'm just adding a nice thin layer of gray. Again, this is Payne's Gray here. Just to help tell that story, paint it in a little bit, and I will add that shadow towards the end of the painting. Now my big back strip of land here that's kind of flat to the horizon is going to be green. I'm just trying to, when I'm thinking about this composition, I'm thinking that this is probably not farmland. This is probably kind of a natural space. Maybe there's some bushes, maybe there's like a nice big field out there, but it's not something that's being farmed. So I imagine that this back area is a little bit more natural, which is why I'm going to make it green. So I'm doing all the same things though. I'm starting with that yellow just to give it a bit of contrast, give it a bit of a brightness. Adding in that yellowy green. There we go with that yellowy green color, almost like a lime green. Trying to make that blend feel nice and smooth. And then right at the base, I will add that darker green, that kind of bluey kind of forest green that I've been adding for my shadow. And because we're doing wet on wet here, these colors are going to blend together in their own way. I could probably never do another painting that looks exactly like this, and that's because watercolor tends to take on a life of its own when you're giving it this kind of flexibility with wet on wet painting. And I think that's one of the things I love about watercolor is that you can let it help you. With acrylic painting, you kind of, where you put the paint is where you put the paint. But with watercolor, especially wet on wet watercolor, sometimes where you put the paint isn't where the paint ends up, right? So you have some control, but the watercolor also has just a little bit of control. And I think that's nice. So now for the sky. Again, most of this painting is still just a little bit wet, but the sky part, everything touching the sky is dry, so we're going to do that next. I like to fill in the whole sky with water, and then I'm going to add a nice light blue. Now, normally I like to do Payne's Gray for my skies, but because I have so much in the mountain, I want some contrast here, so I'm just going to go in with a very light little streaks of blue here. And the reason I'm adding these kind of lines of blue rather than filling in the area like I did with the grassy areas is because I do want to, again, create a little bit of texture in the sky. Maybe there's some cloudy spots on a relatively nice day, but you're going to see just a little bit of white coming through in places. At least I hope so. We'll see what happens when it dries. So now we have a pretty dry painting. I waited a few minutes here for everything to dry, jumped back in, and I'm going to be filling in the hay barrel section. So I imagine that this is a hay field, which would make it yellow. So the colors I will be adding here are that bright yellow and yellow ochre. Now yellow ochre is another color I use constantly. It's kind of like a mustardy color, but it just feels so natural in a painting. And it really is like, it's, you know, on its own, it's not the most beautiful color in the world maybe, but when you put it in a painting among other colors, it really adds, it's like a natural yellow. It's a beautiful color. So now I'm doing a little bit of detail work here. We're largely done the painting, but we do need to add in some shadows to help tell our lighting story. And the tractor is going to have the most prominent shadow because it's the closest to us, which makes it kind of the biggest object. And it has the most attention being called to it. So we really want to make sure we do a good job of telling the story of lighting within that tractor. Just adding some of that kind of darker, less saturated but darker brown there, trying to soften the edge so that it has a nice transitional bleed to it. Time to finish off those mountains. Again, this is probably my favorite thing to paint because I can have some fun with it. Like I just kind of drop the paint in and then there you go. It just takes right off, right? And it kind of does its own thing, but in such a beautiful way. And then I'll pull it up just a little bit to get those little like streaky kind of feelings of getting into the snow on the top of a mountain or something. But largely I'm letting it do its own thing. Yeah, that mountain turned out really nice. So last mountain, and I'll just do all the same things here. Just really letting the water take that paint, but keeping it dark on the bottom, light on the top. Now I've only used 2 brushes here. I've been using an 8 brush and I believe a 0 brush is my detail brush. So just 2 brushes for this entire thing. Really important to have clean water handy so that when you lay down your water before your paint that you're not adding in a color accidentally. So 2 containers of water is very important. So now I'm just filling in those, the light part of these trees. So again, this is that kind of lime green. And then I'm going to just drop in a little bit of shadow while they're still wet. Not super wet because we do want that shadow to kind of stay on the one side, but a little bit wet. Adding in our detail work now, filling in the trunks of the trees, adding a little bit of texture to the barn. So this texture is going to add texture and tell a little bit more of that shadow highlight story. So here where the roof is overhanging on the right-hand side, I add a little shadow. And now I'm adding some lines to the barn to make that barn feel like it's built of planks of wood. And I need to just add a little bit more darkness to the other side here. So I'm adding just a little bit of Payne's Gray to my red, just to give it a bit more of a shadow feel. But now you can clearly see a highlight and a shadow in there. You can see some nice textures, which makes the barn feel important amongst everything else. Adding in that shadow to the hay barrels. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of color to them as well. I'm not too worried about the hay barrels bleeding color-wise because it's all kind of the same tone. So I'm just going to go in and add a little bit of that yellow ochre for the shadow and some bright yellow for the highlight on each of these. And I'm just going to kind of lay it in there as I see fit here. Now the last big chunk of land. So I have yellow underneath this and green on either side. So it makes the most sense here to do a brown piece of land. So I imagine this is part of the farmland. Maybe it's soil that has yet to be planted in. But having that color kind of break up there so that we don't have the 2 greens touching too much. We don't have 2 yellows touching. Having the brown up there just helps to give it some pacing. Helps to keep those land hills, helps them stand out from each other a little bit. Again, just getting that darker brown on the bottom and then that brighter kind of reddish brown on the top to help create that lighting story that we're telling. Now that those trees are mostly dry in the background, I'm just adding a little bit more of that dark green on the left-hand side, and then I'll add a little bit of that lime green to the right-hand side. But that's going to be a very subtle transition. We don't want too much detail back there. So we're almost done here. We're just going to add a few more detail elements to our tractor and our barn. So adding some texture to the roof. Again, adding more to the bottom, less to the top to kind of communicate that lighting. Adding some texture to the roof of the silo. Adding a little bit more, yeah, just getting in there with a little bit darker at the bottom there. Jumping over to the tractor. Just adding a little bit of brown into the wheels, making them look like they've been used a bit. Yeah, just filling in some little detail areas that maybe need some cleaning up. And of course, we have our windows. We haven't addressed this yet. The windows in this barn, we're just going to do them kind of Payne's gray. We're just going to keep it dark. We'll keep the door on the left-hand side dark as well. And the big barn doors on the right-hand side, we'll paint those a little bit of a brighter red just so they stand out. It doesn't look bad as it is, but I just kind of want them to have a bit more prominence. And I imagine there's maybe the barn doors have been painted a little bit more recently than the barn, so maybe they have a little bit more brightness to them. Make that shadow just a little bit deeper around the overhanging roof. Having a nice shadow in your painting, even something just as simple as that, will really help it out. And there you have it. I hope you guys have enjoyed this painting. If you would like to see more of my artwork, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, or you can visit me at Creations by Kendra on Instagram or on Facebook. Thank you so much.